Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. On the show today, Mariana Caplan. So Mariana is extremely experienced in psychotherapy. She's written 8 books, mostly on topics of spirituality, on the guru system. I've been listening to a lot of her stuff over the last few years, and she's got an excellent new book out called Yoga and Psyche, which we're going to talk about. Which I was just saying to her is actually now required reading for the yoga teachers that I train. Extremely long background. I think she's what the Japanese would call a living treasure. So Mariana, I'm extremely happy to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for that big, warm introduction.
So how did you get interested in the body? What was your route into this?
Like many people, my body screamed at me. It wasn't... I liked the ideas. I've been studying tantric Buddhism, tantric yoga, and psychotherapy all throughout my adult life. But although, embodiment practices and somatics started in the 1950s, or they can be traced before, it's really only the last 10 or 20 years have seen such an increase in awareness. So when I was doing my trainings in psychology, it wasn't even being talked about. So it was illness. It was illness that got me into it. And I think so many people, so many of the great yogis that I admire and so many of the great healers end up saying they came to it either desperate, or in need. Yep. So I had been practicing psychotherapy, practicing yoga, teaching both. I believe that both are most effectively learned as in the role of student, and then if we're teaching, to be a student and a teacher always simultaneously. And in my mid-30s, I had one of these common but not still well understood immunity disorders, a 3-year autoimmune disorder that I spent tens of thousands of dollars and tried an array of allopathic and non-traditional approaches to heal. And then, although I'd been doing yoga, it hadn't connected with the deeper spiritual training I had had. I'd been doing physical yoga practice. So finally, I found a teacher that connected the dots for me. And it was really through yoga that I healed my body.
Wonderful.
So that's what got me much more deeply in that. And then when I finished the yoga training, or finished, phase 1 of asana training many years ago, having been immersed in psychology for so many years, I still could, then with more access to my body, I was feeling the frustration of things that hadn't changed in spite of deep psychological inquiry, and then could really perceive that it was in my body. And that's what brought me into somatics. And first just calling up a colleague and saying, what's this work you're doing in somatics and trauma? And he told me about it, and I called him the next day and said, can I come in as a client? And after one session, I said, I don't know what you did, but I'm sold. And I signed up for 3-year. This was Peter Levine's somatic experiencing training. But I think there's a number of good schools out there. And then because I had already been a therapist and a yoga teacher when I began that, I spent my 3 years of training working with my trainers and supervisors, integrating what I was learning with yoga from the beginning, because in me, they were already not separate, psychology and the yoga. And then I had this power tool that actually I was already talking about embodiment. I had taught a class on it just because I'd wanted to learn about it. But finally there was methods that worked, and it really connected the dots for me. So
I think that gives us plenty to spend the hour talking about, like what can yoga learn from therapy? Why does therapy need yoga, as the sort of your book says? And I like that sort of way of putting it both ways. Maybe before we get into that, I'd love to kind of, just for the benefit of the listeners, your earlier work on, for example, gurus and spiritual materialism and spiritual bypassing. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit. I know you had some crazy times with gurus and bad times, and kind of really looked at that kind of structure of kind of spirituality. So what's your sort of current thinking on kind of the guru model and this idea of spiritual materialism and spiritual bypassing?
You're asking a lot in a little time, so we'll, skate the issue. I think if we got into the whole guru issue, then it would take our time away from the embodiment. Such a can of worms. And as a young woman, like so many people, I just, my psychology was mixing with my spiritual longing, my psychological wounds. I ended up with unfavorable teachers, with teachers who, after repeating a certain pattern, I even though I was a young woman, I said, wow, the common denominator of these occurrences of me and these male spiritual teachers who are using their power, sexuality, whatever they were doing, the common denominator is me. And that's when I first left one of them and hitchhiked out to California and put myself in grad school. And I went to grad school for psychotherapy, as with yoga, not to become a psychotherapist, but to heal myself. And again, in my life experience, the spiritual longing and the psychological healing, they're truly hand in hand. So after grad school, I went on a one-way ticket to India, spent the next 6 years living in yoga ashrams in India and the United States. But whenever I was in each environment, I felt the pull of the other. When I was doing psychological work, it still wasn't quelling my deeper spiritual longing and would go for those studies. But then when I was in spiritual communities and feeling the gap of our psychological understanding, I was always kind of calling for that. And I had a really good teacher for many years, and he's the one who set me out to write this book on premature claims to enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And until this book, I've always been highlighting the underbelly of spiritual paths, not to call them down, but to enlighten by meeting progressive levels of obscuration and of consciousness.
And
unconscious.
Thank you, Mary. I mean, that needed to be said. I mean, it needed to be said, hey, something's fucking up here. This guru system doesn't seem to be working. There's so many abuses. Culturally, is this even working? And also the kind of, you're right, the epicenter there in California of the kind of spiritual materialism, the spiritual bypassing of trying to work past or overlook emotional and therapeutic issues by, using a spiritual practice. And I think that really needed saying. So I'm glad, you've been on the lead edge of that.
Yeah, but, just to clarify that for me, all of the work of obscuring of bringing to light the shadow on the path was to bring out further integration. It wasn't to take down the spiritual path. There's been people, who criticize the guru model or criticize spiritual traditions. And for me, in my heart and soul, I'm a deep believer. So it was to bring out the shadow to illuminate for the sake of greater light and integration. So I've written so often into the shadow and so much about spiritual bypassing, but it was always, in service of the light.
Yeah, and my sense is it's not where you're at right now, maybe. So, what I caught you saying there was, this longing about when you're in the spiritual world, you are drawn to the therapeutic, and when you're in the therapeutic world, you are drawn to the spiritual. Tell me if I'm wrong. It seems you've had this sort of longing to integrate these great Western and Eastern traditions of working with mind.
Yes, and to integrate myself. Psychology wasn't enough alone, because I had a broader sense, that longing that brings so many people to the path, or maybe we come to the path straight through an asana class, but then that longing is awakened, and at the same time it wasn't enough. I remember back in the day when you go to these ashrams or yoga centers, there'd be these signs saying, leave your ego at the door. And I was like, I'm young and they know more than me, but this just doesn't feel right. What is this ego and why do I have to leave it on the door? And it always invoked this sense of shame. And when people talked about ego, there's something wrong and there's an ego and we're not supposed to have a big one. And something intuitively, and then as I studied psychology over time, clarified that I didn't want to have a spirituality that didn't include all of me. I didn't want to leave this world. I didn't want to jump off a wheel. I wanted to be alive. And at the same time, I wanted to participate in greater expansion. And yeah, so it's like a both and. And again, in the Western world, right, the spirituality seems to touch on the universal, and it seems like yoga has such tremendous success in translating, right, into every country and culture. If it's received and understood that it's not trying to take over anything, it's compatible with, because it's really transcultural and consciousnesses. But then our individual psychological makeup, right, and the stuff that our own hurts and our own wounds, and especially in Western culture, using that term very broadly, is very unique. And Western psychology was created for that.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, why would we leave one or the other if we intelligently access both, we have a more holistic model.
I was talking to Bence from Integral Europe yesterday, and Ken, he's a very big follower of Ken Wilber's model. I know you've taught at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he was saying, look, both of these pieces are really important. Both of these, and they're not, one doesn't replace the other. You can't do spiritual work and then not need therapeutic work, or vice versa. And what I loved about his kind of presenting essentially of Ken Wilber's kind of framing is that it sort of gave honor to both. It said these both matter, and you can't do one to ignore the other. Is that sort of roughly your way of thinking about this too, or what would you add to that?
Yes, I've had this prayer for many years. I know that a lot of people, your listeners, you said, are people who are training, are already leaders, right, in some form of embodiment, whether it's a yoga teacher or a body worker or a point of access for many people. And the prayer has been that anyone who is in any position of spiritual leadership, and not just a big spiritual teacher, but any position of spiritual leadership, engage not only once, but engage in a course of depth psychological inquiry. If it's not psychotherapy, some kind of school of depth psychological inquiry for a period of time. And I wish, right, we could never mandate this, but that it was required. And for myself, the model I'd like to set forth is that I take that on every developmental stage of my life. Maybe every 10 years, it's not an exact amount, but every developmental stage of my life, go back in and retrieve, what's now available to me in this developmental stage of life. So to continue to do that, and that's been my prayer. And I think if spiritual teachers and yoga teachers, if people were doing this, the amount of scandals would vastly decrease.
I mean, I'm really with you on this. I always do a little bit of shadow work with my students, and I encourage them to go into long-term therapy. I'm in long-term therapy myself. I'm in supervision. This is things that I recommend heartily to anyone. I mean, let alone spiritual teachers. I don't consider myself in that category, but maybe let me play devil's advocate a little bit. Like, if someone's listening to this, they're a yoga teacher or a dance teacher or a karate teacher, and they're maybe thinking, yeah, maybe for spiritual teachers, but why do I as a body person need to do this therapeutic Western work? I'm a yogi. That's all I need. So what is therapy, to use your headline?
Yeah, well, that's really what I was trying to point to, that even if we don't consider ourselves in positions of spiritual leadership, right, to be a yoga teacher, you just have to go through a 200-hour teacher training. And for someone who's not explored spirituality and they're reading, headlines in yoga magazines about yoga as this path for mindfulness and inner peace, right? You may be 25 or 30 or 35 years old and just be teaching yoga classes, but you may well be your students' first inroad into spirituality. So it's not about self-identifying. I've never wanted to be a spiritual teacher. I've never considered myself a spiritual teacher, but I'm still aware that I'm having impact on people. So that's why I'm, that blessing or that prayer goes much wider, that if we're in any position of leadership, I think it's a good idea anyway, quite frankly, in today's world. But if we're in any position of leadership, it's really undisposable. And I've been in teaching situations because I've been navigating these two paths where I've been around other yoga teachers and they're teaching and they're saying, psychology is really important. I have a lot of friends who are therapists and we have deep conversations, and that's that's, I'm really advocating for psychology, and this happens a lot. And like, I want to say that having friends who are therapists or deep conversations with friends about psychology is not the same as availing ourselves to, depth psychological inquiry. And when we add this embodiment piece into our psychological inquiry, it's available, it's effective.
Yeah. For me, there's a point in my own teaching where I went, you know what, I need to do the trauma work personally to have clean hands. I need to be in supervision. I need, I saw as the sort of power and the status increased to a degree, I went, okay, this could be really dangerous. And I'd seen the past generation, the sort of baby boomer generation, who were my teachers, just make so many of the same mistakes with this, particularly the guys, if I'm honest. And I went, okay, like, what can I put in place which is going to give me a better chance than that? And, for me, like, maybe you could speak a little bit to like doing your own trauma work as well. Like, that's something which isn't generally in the Eastern approach, right? I know you work with Levine, one of the big names in trauma. How can doing our own trauma work help us as yoga teachers or Aikido teachers or whatever?
Yeah. And it's a good distinction you're making. For me, somatics and trauma, they really go hand in hand, but you're highlighting that may not be obvious to everyone. And one of the things I appreciate about this conversation, right, I'm sharing about my own therapeutic process and my ongoing commitment. And you're talking about that. And it's so important for people to model, like, hey, like, we all need this. And it's not just a one-time deal where we fix ourselves up. And it doesn't mean that you have to be in therapy for the rest of your life. But it's a path of studying the psyche and teaching that, a path of studying the body, a path of studying the spirit, and teaching that is a path of possibility for endless deepening, right? Endless possibility. But with that, one of the definitions of transpersonal psychology when I first began to teach at university so long ago that grabbed me is that a full spectrum psychology should deal not only with the spectrum from our psychosis and deep neurosis into our fullest possibilities, but also to attend to the challenges of each stage of awakening and the psychological challenges of each stage of awakening and actualization, whatever words you choose. So it's not right. I do this so that I'm covered, and then I do, this higher work. It's that as we deepen and broaden, that there's new challenges that emerge at progressive stages.
Yeah, and the opportunity I feel of doing the therapeutic work is it just frees up energy and creativity for what I'm doing as well. So it's a hygiene factor, right? Like, I want to have clean hands and not be, hurting people because I'm hurt. The whole hurt people thing. But also there's an opportunity in there for my own growth and expansion, that it's like freeing up energy, for want of a better word, to help me grow as an embodiment teacher. So it's not just like, well, I should do this because otherwise, I'm going to do bad things. But it's also like that's part, even though it's a different track, a different journey, it helps with the other one, like, significantly. Is that your experience?
Yeah, it's again, like, right, I wrote this book on yoga and psychology, and I separate these things out to help people understand why they come together. But in myself, I only began to separate them out after many years because I was raised by both traditions, and they're so organically supportive of each other, right? And the distinction you're making is not only so that we won't hurt other people or because it's a smart thing to do, but because the possibilities, right? The possibilities and the expansion, the depth that can grow in us by doing that increases. I train a lot of therapists and yoga teachers in integrating the other modality into each other. And with the yoga teachers, I say, we're going to learn all of these tools, and we'll learn what to say, and we'll learn the methods. But ultimately, the psychological, the size of the psychological space that you can offer in your yoga room, and we could, equivocate that to body work room, or is directly in proportion to your own inner work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's something that's palpably felt. You go into somebody's, X room, yoga room, dance room, body work room, and regardless of what they say or don't say, if there's something almost unconscious and automatic in ourselves that perceives the depth of the space that's available, and that's the space that, right, it's the size of the space that can contain our unfolding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I work with a kind of archetypal yoga practice called embodied yoga. And I say to students, look, you need to embody this really deeply yourself. You need to do your own practice, because if you can't, the student's instinctively not going to trust you, not going to trust themselves to go there with your holding. And I say to them, you might actually want to go 10 times deeper than where you're asking students to go. I used just a random number like 10 several times, because I've same as a meditation teacher. It's like, okay, if you're teaching a 10-minute mindfulness of breathing in business, you need to have done, a week retreat. If you're teaching a week retreat, you need to have done a 6-month retreat or whatever, because people are instinctively going to feel that you don't have the capacity to hold above and beyond what you're teaching, right? This is
yeah. And then the call to just continue to grow. It's one of my teachers as a young woman. He said he was a great Advaita, French Advaita Vedanta master, and he said from the beginning, the true teacher is always a student, and it's not a cliche or pithy thing. It's like the true teacher is a student. We're talking about paths of endless depth and subtlety. A little example as we're chatting about embodiment. One of my embodiment mentors and friends is Reggie Ray. He's an elder.
I hope to get him on very much on the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, he's really an elder at this point, and I was interviewing him years ago for the beginning research of my book, and we were on a call like this, and he was talking to me about an experience. I'm paraphrasing here, but he was talking about something that happened recently in a practice session or a retreat where the space in the back of his second toe on his left foot.
I read that. Yeah, I was like, wow, okay, I've got a lot of work to do as an embodiment teacher. I was
really impressed me. He was, he's so grounded. He's been doing this 30 years longer than I have, and he said, I know all this material had opened and things from the past, and that was a defining moment in my embodiment studies, which is why I put it in the book and share it, because I say, okay, if something can open on the back, and it could be any toe, right? Any finger in the back of the second toe and the left foot, like that's just some direction, right? Some guidance for humility and some direction for how this can go. And your response was my response, like do not assume that, right? With all spiritual teachings, it's very helpful. We can be empowered. We can share what we know. Do not, and it goes back to my earlier work, some premature claims to enlightenment, like landing on, I've got it, I know this, is a very, it can be a dangerous place at worst, and at best, it's just a limitation.
Yeah.
It's a limitation for our own possibility.
It's quite nice to be wowed sometimes, isn't it? Because to me, it kind of gives you the idea there's another level. Like I was on a webinar with one of my teachers, Paul Linden, last night, and he looks at someone on a screen of 30 people on a Zoom. It's like, oh, you just tightened your perineum. Is that what happened? And I'm like, okay, he obviously can't see that just directly. So I'm like, how did he know that? And I'm trained in his work for 10 years, so pretty well. But I went, okay, there's a whole nother level that I don't yet have access to. And I find that inspiring. And, it is a cliche to say the teacher's always learning. And I think sometimes it's worth challenging, when people say, I'm always learning as a teacher, I say, well, when, how many hours a week, what is the current skill set you're actually developing? How much of your income is actually going towards studying with other teachers? I think it's sometimes worth challenging a little bit, because it has become a bit of a cliche.
Yeah, it is worth challenging. And right, because we're holding both sides. When I became a mother 7.5 years ago, I used to woefully, calculate the percentage that my personal practice of physical practice of yoga had decreased. For the first couple of years, I was at minus 900%. And I think I leveled off at a minus 600%. It's not that I haven't continued to study other things. It was a little bit effortless because I came to motherhood a little older after 20 years of study, but really translate that right into my motherhood. So it's right. It's a little bit of a,
it's a fair answer.
It's a delicate one, but right. A lot of cliches, honestly, I feel this, they're there because they've proven themselves to be true many times. So if we don't just hear it and let it like wash over us and take it freshly, right? Like mindfulness or presence and breath asks us to, we contemplate it again and again, and we have to be vigilant, and we need others, right? We need others to help us see what we're not seeing.
Yeah, for me, the communities of accountability and feedback was exactly what a lot of the gurus were missing. Is people that, I like a co-teaching model, for example, and there's there's certain systems and things we have in place at our courses, and that those kind of communities, I think, are really key. Peer relationships as well. I spend a good few hours a week talking on the phone to sort of other embodiment teachers around the world, to have those kind of peer relationships where they can go, hey, Mark, I think you're full of shit, or like, oh yeah, I'm also struggling with that. I also fell in love with my student. Here's what I did about it, rather than it being a secret, So that I find super helpful is reaching out, particularly to guys, actually, I've found for some reason. Maybe there's some gendered pieces in there. Okay. So in terms of integration, this seems to be very much your life's work, is what I'm hearing, of integrating the East and Western psychologies. And in some ways, I'm curious why more of that isn't happening, because starting in Esalen in the 60s, Western therapy was meeting Eastern spirituality and yoga and dance, and Fritz Perls is doing workshops, and Gabrielle Roth. So it's been around a little while now that those two things have been in the melting pot together. But I actually haven't seen any sincere, or very few sincere, attempts to genuinely integrate them. I've seen a bit of lip service here or there. Hakomi maybe is one. I try and do it in embodied yoga. And your book for me was like, wow, this is a clear, down to earth, which I always like genuine attempt to kind of integrate. And I was worried it might be a bit Californian, if I can be blunt. And then I got it and I was like, no, this is really readable. What's that?
I'm from the East Coast.
You're from I normally get on better with teachers from the East Coast. But there was a way in which I just went, yes, this is a genuine attempt at integration that is accessible. It's not like one of Ken Wilber's massive, sex and ecology books that there's no way you can read without a PhD. I went, yeah, this is a book that I can really recommend to students that honors the East and the West.
Well, just first, thank you. I really appreciate that. It was 6 years of practical work and a whole lifetime of study, and my intention always as a writer has been that whatever I write, it be accessible to people. So thank you for that. And I think you raise a really good question. So right, we say it's been around for a while, but then a while is right. It becomes sort of relative because right, yoga's dated to it's got a kind of broad span, but 2,500 to 5,000 years old, and
not posture yoga, but okay, I'll roll with you on this. I'll roll with you.
But then, last I checked, psychology is about 130, maybe 8 years old now, 139 years old. Right. So then halfway through psychology's life, East starts to meet West, and it starts to be talked about. And actually Buddhism, right, has been way before yoga in its willingness and its recognition of the importance of integrating psychology. Not everybody, right? There's still the two camps where the kind of orthodox camp, which says it's just diluting the true teachings and making everything relative. But Western Buddhism has been integrating psychology for making active efforts. Not that psychology is
really happening at places like Spirit Rock, right? I mean, like on the West Coast, there's some sort of genuine kind of attempts in kind of Buddhism to integrate some of the psychological knowledge.
Yeah, right. It's more the Western teachers who are recognizing that because they have a Western psyche and they're seeing it. So an Eastern teacher comes and not having a sense of the Western psyche, right, may not be registering it in the same way, or some of the progressive ones are trying to, but they don't really know what we're made of. They can't feel it. They might see it. So it's the Western teachers, right, who are studying Eastern traditions that have been the proponents of integrating it. But yoga has been so far behind, in this relative time. It's really just starting, right? Seeing somatics programs in yoga studios, right, here in California, it's been going on a lot for the last 3 to 5 years, just starting. And then I think another challenging layer of the question you propose, why aren't these being integrated, is because to effectively integrate, I must consider this carefully, but it's hard to integrate depth psychology, with spiritual traditions without having the breadth of psychological knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And so the challenge I find with a lot of the somatics programs that are being offered is somebody will go take a 200 or 300 hour somatic program, and then when we're offering an integration of somatic or psychology and yoga through somatics, I appreciate it, but psychology is very, very nuanced. It's as nuanced and deep and sort of as you could say quickly, but also slowly, right? A spiritual understanding. So I do honestly believe that it's beginning. I do believe that it's beginning in yoga, and somebody had sent me a blog and I really appreciated it, starting to make the distinctions on if you're going to study somatics or psychology in yoga, or teach it, what kind of qualifications, what does that mean? Or if you're looking for a program, how do you begin to make discernments? How do you make discernments for a spiritual teacher? How do you make discernments?
You wrote a book on discernment, didn't you? It's a word I love, and I think is much missing sometimes from the say yes to everything kind of spiritual acceptance kind of vibe. This idea that discernment is super valuable on the path, I think is critical. Yeah. And I think even more so in the modern world, right? Because there's so much. As we're on the internet, I can fly to California. I mean, I'm going to go to Hungary to do a thing with Bent soon. And there's so much that's available. Discernment becomes even more important, surely, in that situation.
Yeah, it's everything. When we were titling that book, I wrote it a while ago, but it was the last book I put out, I wanted to it's called Eyes Wide Open, Cultivating Discernment on the Spiritual Path. And we had a big debate with my wonderful publisher, Sounds True, because I thought we should say discernment in the title, and they agreed with the principle, but at the time they said, nobody's talking about discernment, and could discernment sell? Will people actually know what we're talking about? And again, fast forward 10 years, discernment is becoming, at least in intelligent spiritual circles, it's used all the time, and this discernment, right? It's like the breaking apart. It's the making distinctions. It's how to be a really intelligent consumer, if you will, of your psychological, of your spiritual pursuits, because of this mass marketplace, mass marketplace.
And it does seem to me that yoga is integrating a little bit of somatics and feeling. It is questioning the guru methods as they come, coming down one after another. It is integrating trauma sensitivity. That is, actually to the point of being a bit neurotic sometimes. But I'm seeing 10 years ago, my main teacher's a trauma therapist, and 10 years ago I was working with him, and no one in the yoga world had any idea. And now it's actually becoming, pretty normal to do a trauma sensitive CPD, 3-day course, or, some basics included in a teacher training, for example. Though, as
I
you
think
said,
it's beginning. I mean, honestly, I think I agree with you that it's starting to happen. But I think, right, you work in somatics and I live in California. So
I live in Brighton, which is the California of England.
I always get a reality check, right? I just did a whole New York City book release, and a wonderful teacher there who's pioneering with integrating Buddhism and psychology and psychiatry and with some yoga. He was saying in New York, right, where a lot is happening, that that he feels like it's just beginning. And then we talk about, right, the mainstreams or the many lands, right, where people are practicing, and so it's just beginning. But let's say it's beginning, a good 40 years behind where Buddhism has already been taking it, and these things take time, and right, the change happens one person by one person. Somebody listens to this or something else you're doing and says, hey, maybe I will take my own process more seriously, and I will do the therapy. And
it's a really big ask that to do, for example, to do a therapy qualification is something I've been looking at. I'm like, God, that's at least 4 years, and it's to do a decent amount of yoga. It's not 200 hours, that's a real, I've been apprenticed to a couple of yoga teachers for about 10 years. I'm just starting to feel like, okay, I'm starting to get something here. Like to get an Aikido black belt, to become trained in somatic experiencing like you did, like these are serious things. Like in order to get, meditation like that, to have a solid daily practice and do several retreats a year for a few years, like it's a big ask, isn't it? Because there's so many pieces now, like the trauma piece, the somatic piece, the traditional spirituality piece, the meditation piece, to integrate them. If we're going to be qualified, and I love, well qualified was in your book a number of times. I don't forget the exact wording, but it was like, you should be qualified. Like that's pretty, that's a big ask for people, right?
Yeah. It's a big ask, and what we're representing are the great traditions. We're right when I say often to clients, because the work can be so hard. I said, here we are, like we're doing heart surgery and brain surgery together, but we're doing it on the invisible. I couldn't imagine what it would take to get through med school, but sometimes I think, well, at least once you have, you're touching like some things, not always obviously, but with this, right, it's like we're doing open heart surgery on something that's invisible when we're guiding people and right in mindfulness. Mindfulness is just a sort of scientific and more codified delivery of ancient Buddhist practice. So it makes sense that, if we want to do a trade, right, to get great at anything is a period of time, but these are not small affairs. These are great affairs. It makes sense that it really requires time, and it's almost why for these kinds of things, the people who stick, we're there because of a love for it. We're there because of a love for it, right? Yoga is a lifelong love affair, and I think a good psychological healer, they're in it because of vocation. There's jobs and trainings we can do, and a lot of them can lead to a lot of money quicker than these traditions. We're in it for the love, and if it doesn't capture us in that way, it can support everything else we're doing. But in terms of it's really almost meant as a vocation. And I put one chapter into the new book, right, just kind of hypothesizing of Western psychology becoming like a Western world spiritual tradition, and it's a hypothesis, but enough so. I've been thinking about it for long enough that if we take depth psychology and we drop it into these spiritual possibilities, and we add in the embodiment and trauma healing, it's more than far more than what traditional psychology would have ever offered or even suggested that it offered.
Yeah, you can't add body and mindfulness to Western psychology, which is essentially what's happening. Those things are being added and expect it to not become a spiritual practice. I mean, like I don't see any other way it can go is those things become like infecting it in a good way. That's kind of how I see it. I see this with psychologists I know who have started doing a bit of yoga, and all of a sudden another aspect opens up for them, which is different. And I also get the piece around feeling underqualified myself. Like I'm going back to school for 5 years. I basically spent 10 years intensive study of somatic stuff, and then last 10 years teaching. And a lot of my students think I'm insane. I'm like, well, I'm really stopping teaching for the next 5 years, except for a few little bits, because I want to study for 5 years before I have kids. And my student, like, basically I want to do like 5 yoga teacher trainings. And I want to do this, I want to do that. And I'm like, okay, this needs to be a full-time thing for 5 years. I'm essentially doing a PhD. I'm trying to get Don Hanlon Johnson to supervise it. And it's this very practical applied thing. And my students think I'm mental. They're like, but you're already competent. You can already teach. You're a good teacher. And I'm like, yeah, but there's so much more. And I want to really dive into that while I still have some time and energy. It's almost like I didn't know what I didn't know. Mm-hmm. Now I do. It kind of horrifies me because I'm aware that I'm doing open heart brain surgery, as you put it. And it's like, okay, wow, this is a big responsibility. So that's the tricky thing. I think it can be difficult for people to see that they maybe need some of this stuff. Like, I don't need trauma training or whatever it is.
One distinction to make, like, I really appreciate what you're saying. But just, you said a few minutes ago, right, I didn't know what I didn't know, right? Until you get farther enough in to actually understand what we don't know. And if we understand that, and we understand not exactly where we are, but get a bigger picture, and we can really clearly sit in that. And as one of my Sufi mentors, Levine, he said many years ago, by way of a kind of backhanded teaching, but he was saying, we were in a group, and he said, that's why Mariana's books work so well. And I was like, what? And he says, she doesn't say more than she knows, and she doesn't say less than what she knows. And it was super helpful, right? It was more like guidance for me. Like, oh, right. If I don't try to overstate or be more or less, which is equally important, right? But like really clearly, not as a gesture of humility, but like really clearly, and not just once, but repeatedly, help people to understand, right, the scope of what I'm offering and what I'm not offering.
Scope. I think that's really important.
Then we can maintain integrity.
Yeah. So it's a yoga teacher not giving relationship advice, or giving even we've had other yoga teachers come on and talk about, Matthew Remsky talks a lot about this as well, and other yoga teachers come on and say, look, I'm not here to give physiotherapy advice, let alone advice on your spiritual life or your relationships or nutrition or a million other things. I think knowing the scope of one's competence is important. Like if you ask me about Russian, I'd be able to tell you, well, I'm mildly competent. But if you ask me about Hebrew, I'd say I'm far less competent. If you ask me about Swahili, I'd say I don't know anything. There's some positioning of what I know in those domains, right?
Yeah. And the reason it's important is because, I really appreciate what you're doing. And it happened to be that I spent my adult life doing these things and managed to, live that as a career. But there's this whole world in need of healing. So I have a colleague who I've trained, and she's been doing this work into firefighting and law enforcement, right? And she'll train other yoga teachers to work with firefighters, and they'll go off, right, and work with the firefighters. And it's like what they're receiving from somebody, who may have a 200-hour training plus, this education and a commitment to ongoing work and practice. There's this whole, it's so much more than they would receive otherwise. So that's why, like, we can own what we know, and try to transmit that. But conversations like this, and I'll share my own reference for this. It's just very helpful. Like when I wrote about premature claims to enlightenment, because if we don't know what we don't know, then how would we even know how to articulate our scope of competence, right? And our scope of practice. So my particular good fortune, sort of weaving back to the beginning of the conversation, is that when I went on that one-way ticket to India after I got my master's degree in psychology, I was a student of a great yogi in the south of India named Yogi Ram Surat Kumar. And he was one of the masters of old. He died about 17 years ago. And although I was a very young woman, I really stumbled into the presence of the greatest yogi I would ever know. And I didn't really even know what I was perceiving, but I knew enough to almost store it away. And I saw somebody, he was in his 70s by the time I'd met him, and in the history of his life, this enlightenment thing, or the transition that he'd gone through, had happened 40 years before, right? And then he was just kept going with, velocity and surrender. So I met somebody who raised the bar, right? Raised the bar, dropped the bar, took the sides off. And that was before I ever studied asana, physical yoga practice. I spent a year in the company of that person, and that became my biggest protection on the path, because it just made clear to me for the rest of my life what the possibility. And it was like it didn't make me feel humble. It just humbled my perspective of yoga.
Okay, I thought I was on 80%, but actually I'm on 8%. Now I've got a different idea of what it looks like. And the key question here, Mariana, is how was his handstand? How was his downwards dog? Surely it's
right. And never posture and hardly spoke.
Did he have leggings? Did he have good leggings? Sorry, my British humor there. You've reminded me a little bit with my jokes to think about culture here, because you're talking about, by the way, this podcast is really, we talk a lot about culture on the podcast, because I've deliberately on this podcast limited the number of Americans actually, and tried to give a stage to people from the Middle East and Europe and Japan and different other kind of countries, because I have this love-hate relationship with California, because on the one hand, it is the center of modern somatic work. There's no doubt about it. There's great, I remember seeing your course online a couple of years ago. I think, I wish I could get there. And, I didn't have the money at the time. But on the other hand, there's this cultural dominance. It is by far the biggest force in the kind of embodied world. And I'd say spirituality too. And I wonder, in the same way as you're integrating Western and Eastern psychology, there seems a disintegration of a kind of culture in a way. Like, I don't see other cultures. I see it as sort of an attempted integration between Eastern and Californian, and everything in the middle doesn't seem to be integrated. Like I had in last podcast, I just did was an Israeli guy, for example. It's such a different culture. I work in Russia a lot, and it strikes me there's a lack of lack of cultural integration sometimes in the somatic field. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it makes great sense, and I don't have I just am appreciating that you're doing that. I wish I had some broad sweeping perspective on that. When in 2014, so I was about midway through my research for the book, I had 20 interns working for me at this point. I put out a call for some help researching the book, and I got 20 helpers. So I said, okay, let's all go to work and see what we can do together. And that's how the academic research came that got integrated into the book, and popular research. And then we created this first international yoga and Psyche conference in 2014, again in California, in San Francisco. But it was a total experiment. I had the support of the university, and I put out a call for papers. I'd never done it, saying who else is out there in the world, and really not knowing if anybody was going to come, or more than a few people. And at that conference, so this is 4 years ago in April, 150 plus people came from over 12 countries and came together in San Francisco for 3 days, who were working on some aspect of integrating psychology and yoga. So that was, it was a high point of my life and my career to be in this, to be in this space where like by making that call, because I think it's happening in these pieces, but people feel like really separate. And I've been talking recently to a woman in Brazil who was at the conference, and I was teaching last week out east, and a woman from Iowa, a yoga teacher and psychologist, was there and saying, she's doing this work in Iowa, but she's the only one. She said, it's good for business, but I don't like it because it's lonely. But that, at least that said to me that it's happening in these different places. And I think one of my visions that I haven't been able to fully figure out a form is hoping that this book and maybe some forms I can create on the website can be a place where people can meet, because that conference, right, it was the place where it was such a relief to have.
That's what's nice about conferences. I mean, I'm sad I missed it, and if you want to do the next one in London, I'll sponsor it for sure. So
somebody asked, will you put in another one? And I said, gosh, the next time I find like 4,000 spare hours to do largely in paper.
No, that's the thing with big events. The first time you don't realize how big a big event is. It's like an innocence going into it, like first love. And once you've done one or two, it's like, oh God, can I do that again? This is that sort of, I don't know, maybe we could jointly hire someone to put it on or something like that. It could be fun, but that's another conversation. How do you think then, as a sort of East Coaster in California, how do you feel that Californian culture, which again, I don't want to criticize, because I really do see it on the lead edge, but how has it biased this conversation? It doesn't surprise me. The World Conference was still in San Francisco. Like, do you think there's it would be, I mean, if 90% of the world's embodiment teachers were Russian or Israeli or English, there would be a bias, right? So I'm curious, like, what you think the bias is there.
2/3 of us in California aren't from California anyway, right? We're here because we're from other places and wanted to be among other like-minded people. I say 2/3. I honestly don't know what number, but more than half. So it isn't as Californian as it seems, even though at the same time it's certainly not as multicultural as we would prefer. So I don't know the answer to that. But when I go teach in the East Coast, for example, or I'm going to be in Spain this summer doing some work, when the book comes out in Spain, love teaching in Spain. I love the Spanish. Is that it's refreshing. So the thing that's a little challenging for me in California is, as I think one of our weaknesses is as a collective, not necessarily as individuals, is like, oh yeah, we're around everything. We know all that. We know what embodiment is. We know, what enlightenment and awakening is. And it's not that people are saying that or even thinking that. It's more like a sort of collective lethargy in this kind of oversaturation of spiritual offerings. And then I go to a place like New York City where, a lot is happening spiritually, and there's more humility and more groundedness and more pragmatism. I rarely have encountered in all my work in the East Coast or in New York City major spiritual bypassing from participants, or this been there, done that. Yeah. Dude. And then, when we say Israel, I'm Jewish and we have family in Israel, and I go there, and, the reality of suffering and is so palpable. So, again, what I appreciate there is like, there's no bullshit. That's what I like about Israel and Russia. There's that directness, and the downside of that is there's a really hardcore trauma history that Marin County doesn't have. And the positive of that is that I like those countries can be quite robust. People aren't oversensitive and quite direct, and I personally like that. And the other one I see in the Anglo countries, like England and Ireland and Australia, is like a sense of humor with it. Like an added humoral element. They swear more and make more jokes. And then the Southern Europeans, like I also love Spain and Italy, there's this communal, it seems like Americans are much more individually focused, and the Brits to some extent,
Whereas then there's this very communal Spanishy Italian thing going on, and a pleasure loving, like a real like love of ease and pleasure, which I find wonderful. I don't know. I guess I just invite listeners to listen to the different podcasts, and because I've had guests on from everywhere. So like, here, listen.
Just to add to that, because I love the Spanish so much, I was asking a friend of mine who's Spanish, who had taught in America many years ago. She'd been in America for maybe 10 years. And I said, okay, so how would you articulate the difference between the Spanish approach to spirituality and the Californian or American? And she said something, Marina Romero, you may know her, so brilliant. And she said out here in the West, it feels like people are waiting to heal enough and become evolved enough so that they can really begin to live their lives and enjoy their lives. And in Spain, people are started just enjoying living their lives while they're pursuing growth and development. And it's like, that really matches my experience. Because there's maybe not be the severe trauma history, certainly, of Israel or Russia, but the wound of self-hatred and self-negation that comes from all of this separation and alienation that we experience here. And this part of the Western world leaves so many people just so much body hatred and not good enough and self-hatred. So the need to have to fix something before we can really live and share.
Yeah. I was sort of joke. So California is like life's perfect, but everyone hates himself. And Russia's like life's a nightmare, but it's a little bit different. It's just kind of like, what's going on? It's something really curious to me in that I still haven't figured out. I wonder if there isn't another wave of sort of disembodiment, because on the one hand, I see like your integration of therapy and yoga and these other practices. On the one hand, that seems to, be a force for embodiment. So what's most live for you right now? Like in your own practice, in your own yoga, what's most live for you?
Yeah, the practice of gratitude after all of these years. A teacher they were studying with was articulating, the need to grieve and the need to praise. And I really resonated with that, but not a spiritual bypassing practice of gratitude, but with so many, right? I think as we grow and mature, and some of the veils between ourselves and what's happening in the world and ourselves and growing older and all these things sort of thin out, and that placing attention on gratitude and praising and appreciation, right? And that we couldn't say is a direct consequence of embodiment or yoga. It's just a response to your question. And
no, I love it. Huge.
And I now have a 7-year-old child, and I think I was somehow born with this innate sense of sort of death and the preciousness of life. I don't know if I was born with it, but I've been feeling it my whole life. And then with a child, marking that time so viscerally in front of you as it changes week to week, month to month, it's like how to appreciate without grasping, without holding, these moments that are just folding under so quickly.
My wife
is with me a lot.
That's my wife and I's nightly practice when she's not playing poker at night. If we go to bed together, the nightly practice we'll do is to say 3 things you're grateful for. And it's just a really simple practice, felt in the body, as we say. And one of them is inevitably being with the other, because we were kept apart by this kind of visa nightmare. And it's this kind of such a simple little bodily great practice at night. Just offer that to anyone listening as just a super simple little practice. Just try it for a week, with your partner or on your own. A little. I do it bowing when I'm on my own, and that's been profound for me. A few more things now. I know we're nearly on time. One of them, I wasn't able to find a sort of yoga class online taught by you or one of your students. I'd love to know what it actually looks like to do yoga with Psyche. Like, I'm probably going to have to come to California. But like,
no, that's the whole point of teaching online is you don't have to come to California.
Send me your dates. Send me all your dates for next year. But what does it look like? Like, I'm imagining like an asana class with this sort of therapeutically informed aspect. What are the nuts and bolts of that?
Yeah, I just got through teaching this for a week, so it's really fresh for me. And right, the context is one's own psychological practice. I know we've said that, but it bears mentioning because that's the context that one is pursuing their own deepening, because that's going to be translated, right? And with yoga and embodiment, our language is just offering the most subtle cues, and it can't just the practice that would satisfy couldn't just be somebody parroting what they were taught, but really feeling into it. And then there are tools, right? There's pragmatic tools. So in my book, section 3 operates independently from the rest of the book and in support of it, but it's a practice manual. So I took some of Peter Levine's and the most meaningful practices from different spiritual traditions that addressed both yoga and psychology and articulated them there. So then there's tools. We can talk about them, but helping people get into their bodies and find pleasure and wholeness in their bodies, helping people learn to experience emotion as sensation in the body, a real powerful tool. Some of these practices of right, how to turn toward the body gently and in small amounts, what Peter Levine calls titration, and how to move between the pleasure and the contraction, what's called pendulation. So there are sets of tools. And so then we're in a yoga room. And again, what if you're working with a group that may be rotating, you're teaching an hour and a half class of rotating people, you have to modify the size of the psychological space, right? I feel very comfortable when I teach that even if really deep material comes up, I'm prepared to handle it. But as I told the students, I wouldn't have been able to say that 20 years ago, and I shouldn't have said that 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So then there's language like telling people right at the beginning of class. I teach teachers to do this. In your own words, once you get this, you tell people, this is a yoga class where we're holding the possibility for yoga as a unification, right? It's often to yoga to unify not only with some imagined projection of yoga or peacefulness or some particular state, but we're working to unify with all aspects of our experience and everything within us. And right, so teaching, just teaching through invitation and telling them, in this class, I am inviting and supporting you to pay attention to the feelings that come up, to the emotions that come up, to memories that come up, that when your mind, because it was always so frustrating to me in yoga classes that they'd say, if anything comes up, if your mind wanders, come back to the breath. And it was very frustrating, this idea that I had to be present with the breath and with my movement all the time, because we're actually, right, as we peel open the body and the psyche, right, in our multi-generational conditioning, we know from embodiment is inside the body. As we are opening it, it opens up memories, it opens up thought forms, it opens up trauma, it opens up feelings. So teachers, it is welcome for you to feel in this class, and not just telling them once, but throughout. And a teacher may say, you're always welcome to go to child's pose, but most people don't feel that they're welcome to, and it's not just child's pose. So we can deepen that and say, right, you are really welcome, and you're encouraged to listen to the instruction, but to pay attention to your own body. And that's going to be the central guide after keeping yourself safe. And if at any point, right, you want to slow something down to get closer to your own experience, or change something, or go into any position that you want to, no questions asked. I may check in with you, but you won't be challenged. And
Thanks.
If tears come up, they're welcome, right? So languaging, so your own practice, certain learning languaging, and then tools. And harder to teach in like a power yoga class. Easier to teach where, and I used to have this vision that we had to have all these psychologically informed yoga teachers to make this available, but because I can't make that happen, I like to train psychologically informed yoga students so that we have the tools, and then we can go into any class where there's enough space, where we're not going to be corrected if we do something in a certain way, where there's enough space, and then we bring our own psychology. I mean, I'm happy to train the teachers because it multiplies in its effectiveness, but when we learn these tools, then with our home practice, or I take these tools to regular yoga classes in my town, and then I just apply them. I don't wait for the teacher to tell me that, because I know, but I didn't used to know, that if I have feelings and thoughts and memories, I could check and see if my mind's drifting, but just as often it's something that wants to be addressed. And if I meet it with love while moving, that serves my it serves my need for connection with myself. It serves my need for physical movement. It serves my need for exercise, spiritual development, right? As a mom, like I have to handle as many needs as I can, and in a condensed period of time. And so a little bit like that.
Wonderful. So we need to move to wrap up. I'll definitely be looking about your trainings for next year. I'm currently sort of booking in my training schedule. So I'd love to have some dates from you, and do an online or an in-person thing. I really recommend your book to people, and I don't always say that with guests. It's one I'm actually starting to read it for the second time, which is rare for me for any book. And as I said, it's mandatory reading for all of the embodied yoga principles teachers, because I just think it's the best book out there by far on the integration of kind of Western Eastern psychology, and very pragmatic in places as well. And it's quite a short read. It's something that isn't too expensive. People can get hold of. Promise listeners, I haven't been paid to say this. This is, from the heart recommendation for the book. And in terms of sort of finding out more about you, there's realspirituality.com, right?
Yeah, so there's just a couple of things I'll add, and I really appreciate that. We spend, as writers, you spend thousands of hours in solitude wondering,
I'm gonna like this.
Is this going to reach anybody? So it's very moving to hear that, especially from your breadth of experience. And so just to backtrack, I was telling you I'm not doing too much because I finished all this book touring, but I am planning to do an online training this fall. I haven't set the dates, but it will be happening, ideally in person and online at the same time, from the Bay Area. I just have to release the date soon. And then my two websites are realspirituality.com, and that has more of my clinical practice and my spiritual counseling practice that I do locally and globally. And then the book's website is yogaandpsyche.com, that has more focused resources, videos, blogs, academic research about this specifically. And one leads to the other. And
great. I'll link both of those and the Amazon onto the blog. Sorry, my mind's going blank. I'm fasting for 3 days, and occasionally my mind stops. So I'll put all those links up. And just to finish, is there any final message about the body that you have for listeners?
I think it's the safest place. Once accessed, it's the safest place that we have to live in and from.
Mariana, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's delightful.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.